My name is Venki Veeraraghavan. I'm on Twitter at VenkiV. I'm going to be talking about the claim-space identity system and the investments we've done in identity inside SharePoint 2010. I finally read the blurb they put about the session, and basically got 3 words. It's going to give you overview, leverage, and extend. So I'm going to try to show you 3 little parts where I can give you the overview, understand the depth at which we put this claim stuff into SharePoint and the benefits it gives us. And then we'll talk about how to use the investments we have done to get external data into SharePoint. That's one of the most common ways developers interact with SharePoint. Mike spent a lot of time before building on top of SharePoint, but I'm going to sort of talk about how to get data into SharePoint. And then for the final thing, I'm going to talk about how to get data from really outside SharePoint. So that said, so if you guys are identity guys who want to learn about SharePoint at the same time, our dev team is actually right now online. They are, if you want to ask them questions, definitely mention them, and they'll try to answer questions. And also for the future, we try to respond to questions that come out on Twitter. So I want to start with sort of the high-level overview, sort of super high level. But it's only one of these slides. These are the main sort of components of a SharePoint system from a sort of structural point. So there's a client, which is a browser or Office client. It wants to talk to a web server, which then in turn talks to an application server, which then in turn talks to our SharePoint content, the enterprise web services that are written inside the enterprise, and then external web services. So the identity problems we have in this space are many. So we have lots of installed identity providers at our customer site. So it could be Windows Integrated Auth. That's the one that we've done a long time ago. It could be ASP.NET Membership and Role Provider that we did in the last version. But as we found, there are lots and lots of them. There is ADFS, there is Ping, there is SiteMinder, there is, I can just keep going, Live ID. And every time those teams or the customer who have those products come and talk to the SharePoint engineering team and saying, hey, I got a new identity provider for you. Here's the business justification. It's really long and impressive. And they're like, can you please fix it? And so we take the engineering team off the work we're doing in the next version to sort of go and fix the identity provider work for the previous version. This has happened 3 times in a row. So we really wanted to make a sort of investment, structural investment, to sort of get identity sort of standardized inside the system so that when people come to talk to SharePoint, we just say, follow a standard, and we'll be able to understand you. The second hop, and I think I mentioned today in Kim Cameron's session, is we wanted to address the dreaded double hop issue. How many of you have coded around a double hop issue? OK. So I think the example I gave is we are petrified of the double hop issue. It sucks. And so we go through great lengths to code around it. And so the example that we have that really tells you how bad the situation is when you have a search server, a query server that answers queries and applies a relevance algorithm to it, it runs on the app server. Now, when you come to the web page and you say, here's my query, and I hit go, it calls a web service on the query server and says, can you please give me the relevant documents? Which then in turn goes to the index, gets the documents, does a relevance algorithm, and then it has a security trim. Of course, it's on the second tier after the second hop, and it has no idea who called me. Right? And so it just says, well, I'm going to send all the documents back to the front end. I'm going to send some extra documents in case enough of them get trimmed out. And then on the front end, we write the code to security trim. This is bad in many ways, in the sense that we're sending all these documents across the wire that we don't have to. We may miscalculate how much gets security trimmed. But also from a performance issue, we're sending too much data. So we wanted to really address that internally inside the system, inside the SharePoint platform, so that anytime a developer writes code, either on the front end or on the app tier or on some other tier, they get the user identity as an sort of just part of the thread. It always is there. And so we've done a lot of work in our shared services framework to allow us to sort of transfer the identity from one machine to the next machine so that you're able to sort of get there. And I'll give you an example. That's one of the demos I'm going to show. Third thing, so we wanted to do authorization over sort of application-specific roles. So you're building CRM system and you're using SharePoint to do sort of collaboration around an RFP document, but you want to authorize that document based on intrinsic SharePoint CRM principles that are in there, sales manager, sales executive. How do you get those roles into SharePoint so that you can authorize over them? Now, from an overview session, this is a little too deep for this session, so I'm going to sort of not talk about this a lot, but we'll blog about it in terms of how to authorize over custom claims. So we'll do that separately, but I'm not going to cover that in detail here. What I will cover in detail is calling sort of both Web 2.0 services and enterprise web services. So we really want to make sure that it's super easy for developers to write web services that can be consumed by SharePoint, and you can get access to the identity of the user that came 1, 2, 3, 4 hops ago. And we want to sort of send that over safely and securely without using God accounts, without using username and passwords, without asking the user for username and password, without trying to store them. Because each one of these things is a disaster waiting to happen, either from an operations perspective, from a security perspective, or from a developer perspective. They're all problems. And so our goal really was to say, there are multiple identity problems in SharePoint, and I'm sure many of you have run into them. So how do we sort of address them all? And so I was literally in Kim's office bemoaning how bad the system is. And he actually handed me the white paper that says claims-based identity. And that was 3.5 years ago. So this is the work that came out of that. And we sort of made this huge bet on this identity work, because in the new world where SharePoint is sometimes in the cloud, sometimes on-premise, sometimes the user is in the on-premise, but SharePoint's on cloud. Sometimes the reverse is happening. So we want to make sure that as long as we are protocol compliant, that identity within SharePoint is not an issue. So that's what we try to do. So the first section is really sign-in. Now, I think you might have seen a couple of demos already, which is about federation. And I'm going to talk about federation as a side effect, but we'll talk about how we deal with multiple authentication. The key request that came from the previous version of SharePoint is that you want to be able to have more than one identity provider on the same website. So in 2007, you had 2 different URLs, and you could have Windows on one and Forms on the other. That had the unfortunate side effect of, if you're collaborating, you just end up having 2 different URLs. So we want to be able to allow the collaboration, the things that SharePoint's known for, across sort of trust boundaries. And how do you do that? You do that with the work we've done here. We also want to be able to provide a standard way in which other identity provider products can work with us, instead of having each one of them write unique new code that runs on top of SharePoint and makes it difficult for the IT pro and for the developer to sort of deal with, because each one of them is a one-off. And then we did an extensive amount of integration in the Office client for the Office client to work with non-Windows app. How many of you have running SharePoint with Forms auth and then find that suddenly Office doesn't work well? Yeah. So there's actually a lot of work to make sure that all the auth stuff that you see on the server, the client participates in as well. So here's the totally basic strategy that we took. So on the left-hand side, we have what is called Dash Classic. That's the Windows Classic mode, which uses native Windows APIs, and it's Windows integrated auth. We provide that because that's the way most people are set up SharePoint today. So when they upgrade, identity is not an issue that you want to put in front of them for an upgrade or for update. Now, we've done a lot of work on the second side, which basically says we have reconciled the 2 systems that we had before, the NT token and ASP.NET, and we sort of said, look, we're going to convert them into a SAML token internally, and then we're going to deal the SAML token from then on. So anytime you create an SP user object in SharePoint, actually in the claims mode, it actually is hydrated from a SAML token internally. It's actually from the claims principal that we get from Windows Identity Foundation. Now, because we had Windows Identity Foundation built into SharePoint, we also get this other bonus. And the bonus is we can actually consume SAML tokens natively over WS Federation and over WS Trust. So SharePoint, because it has an STS, can actually now directly consume tokens from some other protocol-compliant identity provider. So in terms of the work we have to do now as a developer, when you're in claims mode, you no longer have to do if Windows do something, if ASP.NET call some other API, if something else, call a third API. What you now do is you simply say, you get the thread principal, it's a claims principal, and then you sort of get the claims from in there, and then use them to do authorization. If you're already using a SP user, then it's completely transparent to you. You just call call SharePoint and authorize against it, and it'll just all work, even though the principles now are made as claims and not as roles. All right, so that's the high-level thing. I'm going to give you a quick user demo and then a IT Pro demo just to show you how it looks inside. And then we're going to move on to services, which is actually the more interesting piece of work for developers. All right, so you might have seen this kind of screen before. It basically is a sign-in screen that allows you to select your identity provider. So what I've done in this website is I have a SharePoint website, and I've added two identity providers. One is a Windows integrated auth. So what it does is it'll challenge the user on a domain joined machine with NT. It'll do an NT challenge. You'll get a Windows token, and then it'll convert that into a SAML token and then deal with it internally. This is actually by design, so let me just. The second thing I'm going to show is Geneva. So we have a custom STS that is built using Windows Identity Foundation, and that we redirect to it where it'll sort of show you the equivalent of federating out to a different identity provider. So out of the box, there's a very simple UI. So basically, this dropdown will increase as the number of identity providers get registered. But we expect this page to be massively customized based on the use. So you can imagine that you can sniff the IP of the incoming request. You say it's coming from inside the enterprise. You can challenge automatically to Windows. Otherwise, ask them to sort of challenge with the ADFS style credential challenge. So right now, I'm just going to simply do Windows auth. And so what it's doing right now is it's challenging the machine. And the machine is replying back to the server saying, I am actually, here's the Windows token. And at this point, the Windows token has got converted to a claims token and a SAML token. And then this is a classical SharePoint site, which has issue list, and it has the team calendar, et cetera. So what I'm going to do now is show the same thing from a different side. Wake up. So unlike other things, the fact that you have to actually log in here, you'll see that previously I was BankEV, now I'm PKM account. So this is a different identity. And if it weren't an identity session, I wouldn't point it out. All right, so I'm going to start IE. I'm going to go to the same URL. Now, I'm using stock beta 2 bits. We didn't do any work to smooth out the thing. We just simply use beta 2 because what we want to do is when people get their hands on beta 2 of SharePoint 2010, we want them to be able to test. Because one of the problems we've had is the surface area is basically the entire product. Everything needs to be tested. And so we want people to really be able to test in beta 2 sort of where that entity sort of issues are because it's fairly broad scope. So I'm now going to Geneva. And you have to watch for the little flash that's going to come up in a second. So you see that next to the red thing was actually the Geneva STS. Now, what for simplicity, what we did is we had the custom STS, again, challenge us with Windows, and then log us in. And so basically, one of the biggest issues we've had with sort of basic sign-in into SharePoint has been sort of fixed by moving to claims-based identity and so supporting both SAML, Windows, and Forms. Now, from a sort of central administration perspective, you have the web application. And you'll see that we just have multiple IIS web applications all configured with different identity providers. So you can actually have a single farm that has lots and lots of different identity providers based on the needs of these things. We did a lot of this work in order to support sort of the hosted model where you can actually host SharePoint and have multiple websites that have different identity providers. Now I'm going to show sample claims, and you'll see that the UI actually follows exactly that same strategy. And then I promise I will move to code. But I just wanted to show you a little bit of how that stuff sort of goes from the strategy to how the user experience works to how the IT pro sees it. So you'll see that we are actually in claims mode, and there's a single zone. If you're aware, in 2007, you had to create an authentication provider per zone. Now you can say there's a single zone, and you can have any number of providers. And what we basically did was we said, enable Windows. You could enable ASP.NET. And then you can say enable federated identity providers. So this allows you to basically just add on extra identity providers, and SharePoint's able to reason about all of them together. OK, so that's all I wanted to show you there, because that was just the preamble, just to get you going. The one thing I wanted to call out is that we made a structural change in 2010 that basically made ASP.NET role and membership provider. We converted those into a SAML token. And so we can no longer then depend, if you're writing code that actually depended on just the thread.identity automatically, where someone else sort of faked it by putting a piece of code in front of SharePoint that said, here's a thread.identity, that won't work anymore, right? And so the reason is we can't generate a real SAML token out of that. And so what we've done here is to say, you need to implement both a membership provider that has validate user, because you need to be able to validate the user, and then we'll be able to get the user identity and the roles for each one of the roles, and then add them and create a SAML token. All right, so that was the sign-in part. I wanted to just go through that because there's a lot of work that goes in when you're writing code in terms of if Windows, if something else. So the future, you really want to say when you're in claims mode, you just simply get a single object. So let me go into services, which is actually the more interesting scenario. So we have sort of 3 top-level service scenarios. You're calling a pay stub web service in an LOB system, and you want to get that information into SharePoint. And you want to make sure that you don't simply say, it's an open-ended web service, that you say, I'm going to call you, and then I'm going to give you a comma delimited list of people I want pay stubs for. You want it to be secure in the sense that it gets the identity of the user, and then only returns that person's pay stub. It's the same version of it, but now extrapolate a little bit. You want to make the same call, but it's across an enterprise boundary. The third one is actually to say, I want to get information from outside of SharePoint, but it's not even a sort of, it's a REST web service, and you're just sort of getting from a Web 2.0 site. And the final one is SharePoint itself has identity delegation built into SharePoint. So here's the basic architecture for how this thing works. What I showed you up front on the top, the yellow little man, is the identity of the user when he signed in. So he signed in when it's in -classic, it's a Windows identity. When it's in claims, it's a claims identity. So there is a web part now that wants to get access to a piece of code that's outside. So the web part now makes a call. It gets the proxy. All of our shared services now are based on WCF, and there's a WCF proxy that we generate automatically, and it's available on the website. So it calls the client proxy. The client proxy then knows to request a token from the SharePoint STS, and then it makes a call with a claims token. When it's called, on the other side, which is another SharePoint app server, there's a authorization step that takes place. So we can actually enumerate the claims inside and say, this call is allowed or not allowed at the platform level. So you can have a single SharePoint farm that addresses multiple consumers, and you can actually authorize based on which farm, for instance, is calling us. And the farm is a concept that is intrinsic to SharePoint. It's not in a directory. It's not an account. It's not a group. So you come here, and the SharePoint service does some work. But imagine now the SharePoint service now wants to call something else. So what it does now is the outside world actually has a lot of different ways in which it authenticates. So there are old systems that have credentials, so username and password. There are some systems that only deal with Windows identity, like SQL databases. there are LOB systems that will understand SAML. And then there are other web services that will understand only a sort of a standard like OAuth. Now, these are all web services we want to access. This is all data we want to access. So we want a single way to sort of create and take the identity from SharePoint and send it over. So what we do basically is use the appropriate way to get the credential, right? So credential or identity. So in the case of legacy LOB, I would go to the secure store service, get the username and password. If I'm going to a Kerberos constraint delegation, I can actually take the claim of the user that came in, if it was a Windows user, and I can recreate the Windows identity so that I can constraint delegate it out. And so that allows us internally in SharePoint to be claims-based, but interact with Windows-based applications. And of course, if they take SAML, we will use SharePoint STS to generate a SAML token as well. I'll describe OAuth in a second, because OAuth needs a little bit of extra work to make work, but we will use that. So because of the ordering of the sessions, I'm going to use to do most of these demos, I'm going to use a new functionality in SharePoint called BCS, Business Connectivity Services, and a bunch of features called External List. And so this is known to many of you in 2007 as BDC. So what I'm going to do now is switch over. First I'll do the SAML demo. So I'll have a very simple demo that actually gets information from a WCF web service that's sending it out, and it'll do authorization. And then I'll actually attempt to get my movie queue from Netflix using OAuth. All right. OK, so this is the basic part of the demo. So I have a web page. It has some pictures, it's SharePoint, and it has a list over here. And this list is getting data from a SQL database that is external to SharePoint. I'm using this thing called BCS and a feature called External List. Now, it's not very interesting, because in order to get this data over here, it did all of these things. I can just give you a little bit of a So it did 7 different steps to get this data. And we'll sort of walk through them a little bit to go. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at this web service over here. It's a WCF web service. We're going to look at the WSDL for it. System's going to wake up. It does wake up. OK. So the interesting thing about this web service is it's a WCF web service, but it has a couple of interesting things. Right at the top, it has a policy that says it will take an issued token, and it'll take a token that has been issued by this STS. Right? So there's my machine and the SharePoint STS. And it asks for an access token. So it says, can you give me a token that actually gets the user's identity as well, not just the process identity? It is asking a token of type SAML 1.1, right? And so you have written a web service that all it does is assert in the bindings that it wants to get this kind of information. Now, when you go into the BCS session, you learn how to take that, create a BCS model from it, and stick it into SharePoint. So that I'm going to let Steve tell you how to use BCS. But for now, just imagine that there is a web service that we can create a proxy for using declaratively and get the entities into SharePoint. So what SharePoint's going to do is when I'm going to run the web page again, it's going to try to make a call to the web service. And we're going to go into Visual Studio. And we're going to breakpoint when the web service gets called so that we can look at how the authorization happens. OK, so here is my sort of key part of the. So I get called, and I do this check claims that basically simply does pretend authorization. And check claims is a fairly dumb piece of authorization code, but it gives the concepts. What it does is, again, we have used just vanilla WCF. We have not, this particular web service does not use any of the code from Windows Identity Foundation, which obviously gives you a better way to look at it. But here's some very simple stuff on what it does. So basically, when you get called, you get the security context. Actually, let me just put it in debug mode so we can actually see when the thing gets called. I need to get the 3908. Tools. Attach. Did I get the work processes? Five, 3, 4, 8, okay. Okay, I've made an attach. So now I'm waiting on this web service. I'm going to go here, and I'm going to hit refresh. At this point, when I hit refresh, it's going to make a call to the web service, and it's going to hang here. So let me go back. Okay, let's start again. Okay, there we go. So I'm here, I'm doing check claims. I come down here, I pick up the auth context from the call. This is my silly authorization. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say, I'm going to get the claim sets from the auth context, and then I'm going to iterate over each claim. And then further down, I'm basically going to do a actual check. I'm going to say if the claim type is of type name and it contains Redmond PKM account, I'm not authorized. Otherwise, I'm going to be authorized. Now, remember again, when I said I was signed in as PKM account in the VM, the terminal services, but my desktop session was actually as Redmond MenkiV. So if I hit F5, I'm going to see. So here you go. So it says Redmond MenkiV. Now you'll see this little gobbledygook in front. That's what we use inside SharePoint to encode the claims that are coming in. So the W in there stands for Windows. So you'll see T for trusted. So if you're coming in via SAML, you'll see T as trusted. If you do FBA or ASP.NET, you'll see F. But this is our way of sort of making sure that all the entities, even though they might have the same name in terms of the login name, are all disambiguated inside SharePoint. So again, I've come in as MenkiV. I'm going to hit F5, and I'm going to go. But unfortunately, what you're going to find is that the timeout has expired. So I'm going to go back in here, stop the debugging, and then retry. And you'll see that the list should just populate. So that was the good case. It sort of went in, got the information. You saw how the user identity got sent over. And that was actually a feature that was inside the SAML token called ActAs. Now, next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the VM directly, because I was running as PKM account. I'm going to go back to Tools, Attach Process. Oh, do you guys remember the number? 5348. All right, so now I'm good to go here. I'm going to now start a session. And I'm going to hit the same website. OK, so when it's trying to render the page, it was trying to render the web part. The web part went and asked the BDC shim, can you please get me data from an external web service? It came over here. So now I'm going to go check claims again. It's all nice and interesting. And again, the key thing to understand is that this is just a basic WCF web service. It didn't have any dependency on ADFS, on Windows Identity Foundation. You can just build it yourself. And if you just were to build this web service and declare it in BDC, you're able to get that information all the way into SharePoint with the dreaded two-hop problem just addressed for you. So now I'm going to hit F5. And I'm going to find here that I, in fact, did get Redmond PKM account with this login. So I was able to get the new identity of the user over to the WCF web service. And now I'm going to say hit F11. I get is authorized, is false. And then it'll throw an exception, which I've now decided I'm done because I didn't capture it. And you'll see an error in here. Sorry, where did that thing go? So that was timeout expired. OK. So but you get the idea. What we're trying to do is just getting data into SharePoint now should become a much simpler problem. And you don't have to have these complicated discussions that normally run something like this. You're the developer, and your task and your business value really is to say, I have this complicated store. I want to put a web service. I want to send that out. I want to do authorization. Those are all things you like doing. What you don't like doing is arguing with IT about, can you please set up constrained delegation? And they're like, no. Can you tell me who's going to store the password? I don't want to store the password. No one wants to store the password. You don't want to challenge the use of a passwords again. And you don't want to be able to run as sort of a high-level account where you're basically able to sort of do the trusted subsystem. So those are all things that you don't generally like doing, and you're able to now avoid that by using this pattern. So that's sort of the main thing I wanted to sort of cover in terms of making sure you're able to get information in here. And remember, this is actually the third hop in SharePoint, because you first made the first hop was from the client into the front end to the back end. SharePoint did for you. It uses a very similar pattern that we just showed. And then you made the third hop into your web service. And it did that using WS Trust in this particular case. All right. So in terms of specifically how this thing worked, so BCS actually has you can use SharePoint Designer to actually build a model. And the model actually will read the WSDL, and you can say, how do you want to authenticate? And so in this case, what I'm going to show you is what's called pass-through, which means it's going to pass through the identity of the end user through the web service. And so the way it does that, and this is all coded inside, so you don't have to worry about writing this code yourself. So what happens is the identity came in. It first came into the BCS runtime. So that was the work we did in the first demo. So we just showed you how it signed in, whether it's Windows integrated, Forms auth, federation from Live ID, or from ping identity. It doesn't matter where you came from. We did that work and converted that identity into a SAML token over here. So now the BCS runtime has to say, I'm going to pass through this identity. How does it do that? It uses a pattern. It makes an RST call which is request token, security token, to our STS, and it can be optionally configured to actually get an external STS as well. And so if you're doing a lot of policy management when you're trying to make these calls, you can actually call it an external STS. The STS creates a token from the bootstrap token. So it takes the original identity that was given to it, takes the bootstrap token, reissues a new claim, a new token that is meant for the endpoint that I have over here. So this is a second token. It's not the same token that came in over here, right? Because this token was issued to come into the front end for sign-in. This token is meant exclusively for the call between this callee and this called. Sorry, this is a caller, this is a callee. So it's only meant for this callee. So The token is then sent over the wire to the web service, and then you saw the code that basically enumerated over all the claim sets and then all the claims and was able to do authorization. So, and if you notice, almost every single pattern is exactly the same thing. You're trying to request a resource. The resource says, I need a token. You go to the IP, the STS, get the token, and then present it. All right. So, actually, let me go back. I actually want to stop for a couple seconds and actually take some questions, because I think this is sort of some of the biggest stumbling blocks that we have seen customers have with identity inside SharePoint. The SAML stuff was actually fairly straightforward in the sense that we had the problem, there are current solutions, but every day when you try to build web services, there's some problems that you have today. So let me just take a couple of questions over here. Yes?
Does the RP have to, or can the RP ask for claims that were not provided on the initial call?
So the question is, can the RP, in this case the SharePoint STS, provide claims that are not in the original token that came from the logged on user? And the answer is yes. In the SharePoint STS, there's actually a pluggable place called Claim Provider, and you can register claim providers into the SharePoint STS, and we will then, when you sign in, we say, this user, Venki V, has come to this URL. Do you have anything to add? And so at this point, it's your code. You can go look up a database. You can look up anything you want. You can compute. You can say, oh, Venki V, I'm going to look up a database. Find today is November 17th. His birthday is June 2nd. So therefore, he's over 21 for this sign-in, and then issue a claim called over 21 claim, and then send it back in the token. Now, the cool thing is the claim provider actually has another API that allows you to enumerate claims. So you can actually ACL documents inside SharePoint to say only people over 21 can access this document. And so all of a sudden, I'm logging in. I get this synthetic claim that sort of came out of nowhere. It was created at that moment of sign-in, and I can authorize over it. That was the fourth arrow I was talking about, which is custom authorization. There's a whole deck I could do just on that. So yes, it is there. One question back there. Yes?
Make sure the legacy piece that you talked about, that and the secure store, that is what is currently called single sign-on.
Yeah.
And where you needed a Windows identity, you now just store it back into a XAML token. The problem with the current single sign-on was you couldn't do it if you were coming FBA.
Yes. OK, so let me repeat the question. So in 2007, if you came in via FBA, the secure store service didn't actually let you store anything securely. It just didn't support it. It was only allowed for Windows identities only. So the new secure store service, the SSS, as it's called, is completely claims aware, and it can use Windows, it can use Forms, it can use SAML, so you can store secrets for people who are not even inside your enterprise. So it's completely restructured that way. The one other thing I wanted to point out is all that I said is independent of whether you logged in the legacy mode. So if you're even in Windows Classic, that means you haven't gone through the claims conversion at sign-in. On the outgoing call, on this thing, you can still make a claims call. So what happens at this point is, let me back up a couple of slides. Not slides, a couple of tokens. OK, so when the identity came in and was using the -classic path, at this point, it's a iWindows identity, not an iClaims identity. Even then, BCS will know to call the STS. It'll provide the Windows token, native Windows token, and then the SharePoint STS will actually convert that into a SAML token and then issue the call. So all of the rest of it still works. So, and in fact, that was my demo. I logged in, and I was in Windows, and then I converted to a claims, which is why all the encoding was in there. One final question before I restart.
This is a more extensive code path. How's the performance on this so far?
Oh, it's funny you mentioned that, because the beautiful thing about all this adding extra layers of indirection, it does more things. It also slows things down. So we spent a lot of time, actually over 6 months, with the Windows Identity Foundation team, literally in our offices, optimizing code path. So if you go to Sesha's session is over here, 26, SPC 26, he's going to give an in-depth answer on some of the work we did to make performance happen. But in general, we've made the calls to the STS and back and the overhead for the call just a little over Windows. So Windows is about 10 to 15 milliseconds, and our stuff is about 20 milliseconds, 20, sometimes 30 milliseconds. So it's pretty close. And that is literally for creating a new token. But in the services infrastructure, we actually have a lot of caching. So the bootstrap token is cached, and then the actual exiting token is cached as well. And so for the second call, it's almost no cost. And so we have managed to get pretty much every application back to its Windows performance using delegation. And this is, again, we are measuring performance of Windows not with constrained delegation turned on, but with just native trusted subsystems. So we are able to get delegation delegation functionality at nearly trusted subsystem performance. So it's actually, we are very, very happy with this work, but it was a pain in the ass to get it done. Sorry about that, but it was it was a lot. OK, I see one final question. OK, fine.
I'm a little confused. So the BCS is getting together a token that it's going to give to the claims aware service to use. How does it know what claims the claims aware service wants?
So the question was, how does the BCS know what claims was expected by the claims aware web service? And today we don't do on demand, so we don't actually read what it requires. It is possible to, in the full extent of the spec, you could actually say, here is what claims I need. You can challenge back to the STS. We have not done that. What we do is we pass along everything we found to date, and we send it over the wire. So we don't do an on-demand back and forth. Now, again, remember, we expect many times the case, you are writing the web service, and therefore you know who's coming in on the other side. Maybe you have a scenario that's more detailed. I'll cover that. Right, I can talk to you straight after the meeting. All right. So I'm going to now shift tracks. To a Web 2.0 example. So here what I'm going to do is, what we did in the previous thing is actually literally send the user token over. And we do that because the end user trusted the system to delegate the credential over. And this often happens when you're inside an enterprise, and you come to the SharePoint site, and the SharePoint site wants to get some information from your backend system, and it's all good because you're an employee. It doesn't work when you're talking about two websites that are basically very different, and you need to get the user's consent in the middle. And so there are there's a general pattern, which is sort of formalized in the OAuth authorization spec. And so what we'll show you is how we've built some custom stuff on top of Secure Store, and so that you can use the BCS to actually make that call. I'm sorry, it suddenly needs my smart card credentials. Very inopportune moment. OK, so all right, so I'm going to turn this thing off. So what I'm going to do is, let's see here, go to IE, and I'm going to hit this site. OK, so perfectly empty site using Windows Legacy Auth. There's nothing to see here. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create a list using the same BCS. And what we've done is, previously we had a model that showed sales areas. Now we actually have a model that allows us to create the movie queue inside Netflix. And that's actually modeled inside SharePoint inside this model. So I'm going to go find that. I'm going to create a new list. Okay, come on, scroll. There we go. All right, so I'm creating the thing. I'm going to say movies. I'm going to say pick the model and the entity. So I'm going to find this Netflix.NET shim. So basically, it's a little shim that we wrote that converts. It takes a .NET API. It's a WCF service that basically goes and calls REST APIs on the back, and then gets information, and then it looks like a WCF to us. So I'm going to create. OK, so it's going to say unable to display this web part. Now, the reason it does that, again, I'm using just core beta 2 code. The reason it does that is because it actually can't authenticate against Netflix. It doesn't know who it is. It doesn't have the token, OAuth token. So what I'm going to do now is the key thing that's missing in beta 2 is the ability to automatically redirect. And we are sort of building that into the RTM milestone. But what I'm going to do is show you this page. And so you'll see the page is basically a Netflix OAuth handler.aspx. That's all it is. When I click on this, it's going to connect to my page. And the page, because it's custom, it knows about Netflix, actually now proceeds to No, why can't it find Netflix? All right, let me see whether my network is down. This is one problem that I was afraid, is that I can't find Netflix. All right. So my demo is working, but I can't find Netflix. So I'm going to have to wing it a little bit over here. So what I'm going to do is just what it's going to show you is how it automatically redirects to Netflix so that you can log in. How many of you have used Picnic and Flickr? You've seen the general pattern where you basically go to the other website, log in your username credentials, and it says, do you want to allow this application, which is the SharePoint application, to access the information inside Netflix? And you'd say yes. So that's what is supposed to happen. So basically, the request token goes to Netflix, gets the OAuth token, and then sticks the token into secure store. And then when you're able to when you're going to try to do the list, you'll actually go to Netflix and get that information. So what I'm going to do is show you what the code is supposed to do. Now, for this particular OAuth example is actually going to be released as samples for BDC. So you'll have a number of these samples that allow you to target multiple Web 2.0 sites. So you'll see, we have live ID auth handler, we have OAuth. So we have a whole number of them. We're prepping them all up, and we're going to release them out so that you can use it as starter projects to build your own custom solutions against this pattern of problems. So basically, what would happen is you would come into the page, and you would have to actually make the request. I'm sorry, let me move this out. You're going to make a web request. It's a REST thing. So you make a web request call to Netflix. It pops up the UI. It gets a sign-in, and then it returns the OAuth token in the URL. Right? So basically, you are going to get the token. You're going to so this helper basically parses up the query string, and then formats it into a string, and then sticks that into the secure store. So the custom thing that we did was basically when you were trying to access the secure store, saying, look, I need a credential to go to the web service, the secure store says, I don't know who you are. So I don't know who you are. You get Netflix then returns the OAuth token, and then what you do next is you take that and you write the token into the secure store. So you say, I'm going to write this secret, this is session specific, for this user inside the secure store. So the secure store basically is right here. So the API you're really interested in is set credentials, right? So you're going to an external party, getting the token. So it's very similar to what we did in the SAML token, except here what we're doing is we're going to call an external service via REST, get the token in the form of a query string, stick that secret into the secure store, which is our cache, and then for future calls, you just keep using that thing. So let me flip over into a little animation because I apologize that my server couldn't find Netflix. So what would have happened when you saw that is we went to the page, you saw that. The BDC tried to get, we made the call, the web part made a call to the BDC. It went to the secure store, and this little part is the one that's not in beta 2. So it actually did not know how to call the web page automatically. But I hit the page in order for you to get redirected to the Netflix authorization service. You signed in, you accepted and consented to having my application, which is the BDC application, access the information. Netflix sent my movie queue. And then you saw the code that takes that secret and sticks it in the secure store. And then the secure store then returns the secret back to the BDC, which then provides it on future requests to Netflix, gets my movie list, and goes. Right? And so this way, you're now able to get information from both sort of ASMX, WCF type web service, and the REST web service. And you're using two different auth patterns. One you're using OAuth, and the other one you're using sort of SAML. And all of these are sort of built into the platform. So you're able to sort of basically access any kind of web service. So for future requests, it gets simpler because the token is in the secure store. Now, in the sample that we're going to send out, there's a little custom piece in between here that actually keeps track of the expiry of the token, and it will optimistically sort of go and get it refreshed, so that you don't, when it expires, it doesn't cause the user to actually re-sign in again. And so that is a sort of a custom piece of code because we don't generally believe in automatically reauthorizing tokens. So if the application requires it, you can actually write code to actually just automatically refresh the token to keep it going. All right, so inside the secure store, so one of the things you might know from the secure store in 2007 is not very flexible. And so in 2010, the secure store actually has very flexible schema. And so we were able to model the entire OAuth, sort of all the keys inside the secure store as extra schema. And we're able to now get basically any kind of secret and stick it in there. Again, we no longer call it the sort of single sign-on, which seemed to indicate it was about passwords. It's just called a secure store. Basically, it'll keep secrets, and it'll keep them securely. And that's all it does. So we end up using it for this particular pattern. So finally, to sort of close up, all of the work you've seen so far is completely based on existing standards. And so we use SAML token 1.1. It'll work with 2.0 as well, but we don't use any special features of 2.0. We use WS Federation and WS Trust Federation for doing passive sign-in, and WS Trust for doing active. So when you're, the BDC example that we saw was an active call. We always talk about Windows Identity Foundation. We talk about ADFS. But really, because it's based on standards, we are actually going through a sort of test process to make sure that our standards compliance actually is real, and we'll work with other vendors. So there is no need to install any other code on top of SharePoint to make this identity stuff work. On the wire, it's all standards. We don't have any magic here to put inside the SharePoint side. So it's sort of fairly deep plumbing inside SharePoint to make it work this way. So in the last 5 minutes, I want to close up with key takeaways. So it's a huge, huge change. And I think the magnitude of this change, we had to go under 10 years worth of code of SharePoint. Basically, every line of code ever written by any SharePoint developer, almost all of them, surprisingly, have some assumption about identity. And so we had to go back and ferret each one of those things out, design for them, and fix them. And so we've sort of done almost all of it, but it's not quite done, which is why the beta 2 is a little bit, has some issues still. We sort of deeply believe in the sort of claims-based identity. And in the previous, in Kim Cameron's session, I said I don't think much of federation. My issue is We did all this stuff not to support federation. We did this because we believe that having a single way to talk about identity inside SharePoint actually generates a lot of benefits that have almost nothing to do with federation, even though federation is one of them. We are identity provider neutral, so we really are spending our time making sure that anyone who wants to work with us, we'll just point them to the standard and say, please work with them, and you can work with us. And then the new world where SharePoint runs in the cloud, SharePoint runs in the enterprise, and calls web services both internally and externally are all set up to get called in. I'm sorry. OK. And then finally, we're built on standards. So with that, I'm going to end the session and open it up to questions. No more questions? Yes. The secure story is in Foundations, yes. In fact, all of this stuff is in Foundations. There's nothing inside MOS related to this. Yes?
All right, so how would I take a SAML? You show me, or you have an example where SharePoint can use a non-SharePoint SDS. So it looks like from all the examples,
Yeah.
life starts with a Windows identity in the Windows domain that SharePoint is in. What if life starts not in the Windows?
Oh, absolutely. That is a fully supported scenario. And so we talk about two things. If your identity provider is WS-Fed compliant, for instance, Live ID, what we do is we come to SharePoint, and we redirect you to Live ID. Live ID will challenge you with the username and password, issue a SAML token, give it to us, and then we'll convert them to SAML token, and we'll run with it. So that's one. Then there's a secondary question, which is, what happens if I don't even support WS-Fed, but I need something like SAML-P? So it's the SAML protocol, not the token, but the protocol. What we say is, we are not SharePoint development team is not in the protocol business. You'd want to use an identity product like ADFS or Ping or SiteMinder. So they support all of those protocols because they're in the protocols business. So we will go to ADFS. ADFS then will redirect using SAML to the other identity provider. You get your token, and you're signed in. So that is actually a core part of the experience. Back there.
Does Office 2010 have full support for this model as well? So it doesn't matter what application model you've got.
Yes, the question is, does Office 2010, the client, I assume, support this? Yes, absolutely. There was a demo that could have been done with that too, but it was an end-user demo, and so I figured you had no interest in it. But yes, when you do the client, what happens is the client will actually pop up a Trident control that has the exact same web page that you saw on the browser. And so the client, for all practical purposes, acts like a browser. In fact, it hosts the browser. It'll follow redirects as many times. In the example of the gentleman's case here, it would redirect 3 times, go to the right place, get the credential. It can have not username and password, it can have username, password, and something else. And then it'll get authenticated, and then it'll redirect all the way back. So yes, the double hop problem on the server is actually solved on the server side. But the client actually is, what it's doing is it's doing passive sign-in into the server. Yes?
You mentioned the recreation of a Windows NT identity.
Yeah.
Can you explain under which circumstances
Yeah.
this would happen? And is it possible with an external SDS?
Yeah. So the question is, you mentioned something about recreating a Windows NT token from a claims token. Can you explain more? And under what circumstance? So the thing we need to recreate a Windows token is we need the guy to be a Windows identity in the first place. So it could come in the form of a Windows classic sign-in. So you sort of sign in using Windows. It would come in the form of Windows claims in the sense that you sign into Windows, it actually converted into a SAML token and was sent over. But we do need the UPN. And the way it works is it's actually a feature of Windows Identity Foundation, where if the identity was actually originally a Windows identity, it takes the UPN, it does an LSA logon on that machine, and then generates the identity of the user. And then what you have to do to get it out of the box is you need to do a constraint delegation. So you'll get that token, and you can't do anything with it unless you do a constraint delegation out. Question over there.
So how easy is it as in number of lines of code to integrate the site line?
Now, I can't tell. Oh, so the question is how easy in terms of number of lines of code it is to integrate with SiteMinder. Now, the answer actually should be 0. The thing I don't know is because I'm in contact with SiteMinder to actually do the testing. But we believe that if there are any lines of code that has to be written, it'll be to fix bugs with our protocol, not with our integration. SiteMinder should have no footprint on SharePoint, because what SharePoint's going to do is it's going to come to SharePoint. We're going to redirect by WSFed to SiteMinder. They're going to do what they're going to do already, and they're going to issue a SAML token via WSFed back to us, and we'll just consume it. There should be 0 lines of code. The part I don't know is how many interpretations we've had in between what should be in the name identifier, for instance.
Are you converging with ADFS2?
So the question is, are you converging with ADFS2? So we believe ADFS is more than just the claims that we talk about, because we are dealing with the core identity problem. ADFS has a lot of features around policy management, protocol support, and our view is that's a product that has its own value, and we are not merging with them. We're using the core engine, which is the Windows Identity Foundation, inside SharePoint to build that. So we are completely aligned around the goals. What we have not done is merging the two products together. There's no requirement for ADFS to deploy SharePoint, for instance. Yeah, ADFS is another way to do it. But many times people use SiteMinder to actually instead of ADFS, and so that's really the issue. So 2 more questions. Back there, Red.
Yeah, so is BCS going to be the standard way you're expecting people to interact with web services in SharePoint?
So,
Be writing like web parts.
so the question is BCS the standard way in which you interact with web services in SharePoint? I'll let the BCS guy talk to you about that. He has a session tomorrow. But the short answer is yes. Now, again, some web parts do things that BCS is really about connecting and getting data into the system. But a lot of you write web parts that are not about just getting data into the system, but about reusing data. So I think they're sort of slightly orthogonal questions, but I'd ask you to address it with the BCS session. Last question.
You mentioned the example about age.
Yeah.
Customizations there. So I can go to a document and secure it based on that custom evidence or claim. I just want to make sure that's
Yeah. So the question is, can you ACL a document to a custom claim? The answer is absolutely yes. So what we have done, and again, I did not. That's literally a full session all by itself. Is you can write a claim provider, and the claim provider has 3 basic functions. It augments claims, so it is given an input of the user and the URI that it's trying to access, and then you as the implementer of the interface can decide what you want to send back. You send back a vector of claims, basically, and we'll add that into the token, in addition to what the IP gave you. So now we have the token. The 2 other interfaces are, can you please enumerate the list of claims that you have in your store, and can you resolve them? So if I hit Venki Control K or Sales Control K, I'll issue the call to you, and you get to say, oh, sales manager, sales executive. So it'll give you, imagine Outlook, the way it disambiguates in the people directory. It does all of those same things, but against your custom claim store. So it just, and in fact, in the UI, it's uses the people picker has gone from people picker and group picker to the generic claims picker. All right, so thank you very much. Sesha, who is my buddy in Windows Identity Foundation, and I will be here. We'll be happy to answer questions if you want, but I want to step off the stage. Thanks.